Wonderful. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perkins breakout session today. And thank you all for joining the virtual conference. Hopefully many of you were able to attend the in-person one as well. It's great to be part of the virtual version and keep the learning going. So thank you all for being here today. My name is Amrita Herman, and I'm the Dean of Career Education and Workforce Development at the San Diego Community College District, serving across our 4 institutions. And I'm joined today with 2 colleagues from the region, our San Diego region, both Tina and Ben. Would you like to introduce yourselves? Tina.
All right, good morning. Tina Recalde, Dean of Health Sciences and Public Service at San Diego Mesa, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Ben Gamboa. I'm the Associate Dean of Career Education at Miracosta College in North County, San Diego. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. So we are here to talk about Perkins. We're going to provide you with a brief overview of Perkins, hitting just the highlights, basic components, requirements, and changes from Perkins 4 to 5. Then we'll share what we've been doing to adapt to these changes, implement the requirements of Perkins 5, and what we've been doing to try our best to make these changes meaningful and to create systems, tools, and resources to support the changes. We'll also share some lessons learned and create space for you all to share how things are going, and we can use time at the end for also Q&A. So without further ado, let's get started on the basics. So for those who don't know, Perkins is a federal legislation funding career and technical education. It was first authorized in the 1960s and has been the largest consistent federal source of funding for career technical education in both K-12 and the community colleges ever since. The goal of Perkins is to develop more fully the academic knowledge, technical, and employability skills of secondary and post-secondary students enrolled in career education programs. Perkins does this in a variety of ways. Formally speaking, these are all the ways. I'm not going to read this slide, but I did want to call out a couple of key elements. So first, it's the integration of academic, career, and technical instruction, and the link between secondary and post-secondary. This is a big part of how Perkins funds are utilized. I also want to call out the professional development to enhance the quality of our instructors, administrators, and counselors, and supporting partnerships, so the on and off ramps of our programs, and of course, providing individuals with skills to keep our region and the nation competitive. And most importantly, to specifically increase the employment opportunities for specific populations designated by Perkins as special populations, which we will get into in just a little bit. So Perkins was reauthorized in 2018 and renamed the Strengthening Career and Technical Education Act for the 21st century. Nobody calls it that though, we just call it Perkins 5. It was last reauthorized in 2006, and I bring this up because there's a big gap between 2006 and 2018, and grant managers and faculty got pretty used to the way things were, and when they changed, it was a little bit disruptive, especially because the changes in many ways refocus Perkins to be more explicitly focused on closing gaps with our special populations, and not just improving programs through equipment purchases. I mention equipment purchases because that has been historically a primary use of Perkins, and one of the many, many reasons why you're probably locally spending a lot of time refocusing faculty on gaps and outcomes rather than on equipment needs. Not to say that you can't use it for equipment, it's absolutely an allowable expense and a very important component of ensuring your programs are aligned with industry needs, but the rationale for doing so has to be articulated a little bit differently now. So there are a fair amount of differences between Perkins 4 and Perkins 5. These 8 primary changes or differences capture the majority of these changes. And so we're going to cover these 8. And I did want to just say that there is one major theme, additional major theme in the transition to Perkins 5 that has impacted all of our adventures in the integration of these changes. And this is the noticeable absence of statewide guidance, templates, and resources. So the California Perkins 5 implementation very much places the burden on the local grantee to really know, keep track of, and meet the federal requirements. This isn't necessarily a bad thing at all, and in fact, it can be quite positive. And I don't raise it as a negative, but to just emphasize the importance of understanding what is in the federal act itself and implementing local elements to ensure you're prepared for federal audit requirements should they one day appear at your door. So this is important now more than ever. So I'm going to cover these 8 items rather quickly, just again to refresher for those who know and a good baseline for those who might be new. The first 2 are interconnected and are really the new foundational elements to Perkins 5 planning and implementation. So we are now required to conduct a comprehensive local needs assessment every 2 years, the results of which should directly and explicitly drive your local application development and future spending decisions for the 2-year period. Every investment should tie back to your 2-year CLNA. The implementation of needs assessment is structured around 6 required elements and required expanded consultation. So institutions must evaluate in consultation with a diverse range of stakeholders how overall CT offerings measure up on performance, alignment, scope, size and quality, progress, recruitment, retention, and training of faculty and staff, and then of course, improvement on access and equity. The state has made some really helpful recommendations on what to ask ourselves, specific data elements to possibly assess in preparation and as a component of the CLNA. I did want to mention though that the state has sent signals out into the world that they are reassessing some of the local requirements for the CLNA. So this spring's requirements may differ from the 2020 processes. However, it's really important that everyone begin their CLNA process now instead of waiting for April when everything is due. And we have been advised that as long as we meet the federal requirements and guidelines, we should be in pretty good shape to adapt and adjust the CLNA findings to whatever new format the State Chancellor Office develops in NOVA for this coming spring. So don't wait, act now is the message. So that said, we did want to ensure everyone is aware of a leading national resource for implementing a meaningful CLNA process, which is the ACTE's guide. Within the San Diego Community College District, we adopted many of the ACTE's 2019 recommendations and built them into our district-wide CLNA reporting guide, which includes requirements and commitments at the district and local college level for each required element of the CLNA, including materials to review, data review questions to inform planning, documentation, and action planning. And we can put some of these links directly in the chat in just a moment. So going back to the 6 required elements of the CLNA that we must evaluate in consultation with a diverse range of stakeholders. I like to say that a lot. In Perkins, we've always had, and of course still have, a required industry advisory committee element, right? So where each of your programs funded with Perkins have to have an advisory committee, they have to meet at least once per year and show evidence of this meeting, and you have to hold that documentation on file for audit purposes, et cetera, et cetera. In Perkins 5, the Act specifically identifies 7 constituent groups. So above and beyond the required advisory committee element at the program level, they're identifying 7 constituent groups and requires us to engage these 7 constituent groups in comprehensive local needs assessment processes. The law names at minimum these 7 participant groups and advises us to engage them not only in the CLNA, but also in your local application development and ongoing consultation. So when it comes to managing this expanded consultation with these 7 groups, there are a variety of models an institution can explore. In our region, we pursued a regional approach as well as a district-wide approach for our particular district. So back in the transition year from Perkins 4 to Perkins 5, a regional model to sort of manage this expanded consultation requirement was proposed. And it was focused on an attempt to sort of not duplicate efforts or bombard specific agencies. And it's from this model that we as a region were able to all agree to participate in and utilize a regional CLNA report, which can then be applied to our local processes. So the report includes interviews and outreach to very specific populations and partner agencies across our region. So for example, instead of us all going to our workforce development board, we've got 10 colleges in our region. So instead of all 10 going to the same board and saying, hey, will you sit with this committee and will you review this? Instead, we've engaged with these groups as a region through this CLNA report to integrate findings then later into our local processes. And of course, also everyone keeping that regional report on file for audit purposes. So I recognize it's a bit hard to read, but hopefully you can come back to it as a resource. So this is the model that was proposed. And so you can see where we've taken the 7 required constituent groups and really tried to identify where as a region we advise would be sort of the best fit for them. And so you can see the local advisory committee program level, the local planning committee level, the district-wide level, and for single college districts, this is a blend of both, of course, and then also recommendations on where we would engage at the regional level so that we can minimize engagement. And so for our community college district, the San Diego Community College District, our 4 institutions did adopt this model, and we've been making efforts to align the local planning committees at the college level and program level to meet these new requirements. So within the needs assessment, there must also be specific focus on Perkins designated special populations. So this focus on special populations has to include an evaluation of the performance of special populations, an evaluation of strategies to overcome barriers, programs that are designed to enable special populations to meet local levels of performance, and then activities to prepare special populations for high skill, high wage, or in-demand occupations. The special populations itself has changed a little bit, or the list has. There used to be, well, now there's 9, and you can see these on the screen. It's the last 3 that are new. And also the language has changed a little bit. So for example, we no longer, thankfully, use the term homemaker anymore. And so you'll see some of that language change, and then also the additional 3. So I would be remiss not to mention the incredible work of JSPAC. So this is the California Perkins Joint Special Populations Advisory Committee. They're an incredible resource to help you engage, assess, and work with in partnership your special populations. And so just a little bit of information on the screen for you around what they focus on. They provide a variety of professional development and resources for you and are available statewide for guidance and increased participation of your special populations and improvement on outcomes for your special populations. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the CLNA process, as I mentioned in the beginning of all of this, the CLNA process drives the funding decisions for your 2-year period that it covers, right? So this is a pretty big shift, which impacts the use, focus, and perception of Perkins funds, which really does get us to the required uses included in the Act. So for our required uses, Perkins 5 has, Perkins 4 had the permissive uses, right? So we all remember those many permissive uses. Perkins 5 at the local level removed permissive uses. There are some at the state level, but not at the local level. And they've been replaced with 6 required uses of funds within the Act. And the federal guidelines require each institution to meet all 6, not necessarily each program though. And so an institution can meet the required uses with Perkins funds and or other funds, just like you have in the past. For some interesting reason, the state is still using the Perkins 4 permissive uses within NOVA, so that hasn't quite been updated yet to align with Perkins 5. There are some overlapping components, but they're not actually the same. And to meet federal requirements, local grantees still must confirm that they meet the required uses, not the permissive. So in the past, the state's application and online system helped us meet that federal requirement because it aligned. And so when we submitted the stuff, it was sort of documenting we did. But now, since that's not the case, local institutions really need to take it upon themselves to consider how they're going to ensure for audit purposes that they can show that they do meet the required uses. For our district, we developed a worksheet that we require each institution to complete annually, and we hold on file. It's a very simple worksheet. I have a little image of it on the screen. We'll also throw it in the chat in a little bit. And this is just a simple way to kind of show evidence that we meet the required uses and holding it on file for audit purposes, but it has no impact to the NOVA systems. So I did also want to mention that the 3-year rule in California no longer applies. So that was a California state specific added requirement to the federal guidelines, and it was removed for Perkins 5. And this makes a lot of sense because now that we're focused on our CLNA, that CLNA drives your 2-year funding. And so, if every year the CLNA shows a need for something, you could continue to fund that need to, address the gaps. Now, ideally, you're assessing this so that you're not continuing to fund things that don't actually close gaps. But formally speaking, the California's 3-year rule has been removed. So changes in core indicators. The core indicators are how we're actually assessed on whether or not we're making progress with our Perkins investments. They inform our negotiated Perkins performance targets and are used to assess whether or not we've come within that 80% of those targets annually. There used to be 5 and now there's just 3. So the original 5 are kind of still part of the 3. They're just tucked in there a little bit differently. So here are the 3 on the screen. The state has provided some notes on how they view the alignment between these new 3 core indicators and the vision for success goals. And this is important because you're starting to see more, as we all know, about the vision for success goals being integrated into all of our funding purposes. And you can see this in NOVA actually, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So again, this slide's hard to read. I'm not going to read through it, but again, hopefully it's a useful resource for you when you come back to the slides. It just gives you a little bit of the detail behind the numerators and denominators of these core indicators. It's just a sort of a first step reveal into how this data is extracted and informed. It doesn't give you the exact MIS codes, and hopefully that's something we'll get more guidance on from the state. We're always asking for more information there so we can better understand how this information comes out, when it comes out, those kinds of things. So there's still a lot of advocacy needed in that area, but this gives you a little bit of insight into it. And I did want to say that these core indicators, obviously they're a big deal. I mean, you need to pay attention to them. And they come out kind of late, so it's a little challenging sometimes to integrate them into your planning. So we tend to use last year's instead of this year's because they come out so late. They also impact your quarterly reporting, and this is new. Our quarterly reporting used to be a little different. So now it's all about your core indicators. So in the past, it was really focused on the programs, the top codes that you're funding, and the activities that you've completed each quarter within those top codes. But for Perkins 5, the quarterly reporting in NOVA has shifted to focus on narrative responses about the progress we've made on those specific core indicators. This can be challenging because some of the data isn't available to us throughout the year. However, it is sort of a good tool to help shift the culture, right? Instead of I did this, and I did this, what are you how are the things you've done going to help you make progress on these specific areas? And so it can be a good tool, a good narrative component to help support that culture change internally, but it is also poses new challenges to actually report out on them. I also want to say that there's still a federal requirement to track and report funded program activities. So even though NOVA doesn't require us to submit those activity reports, it's still really important that you are collecting them and keeping them on file for audit purposes. So for our district, we still collect those every quarter in addition to these new narrative questions. So there's no longer those big work plans everyone used to do. And again, that's really another good reason why, since you don't have those work plans, why it's important that you're still collecting and knowing what you're funding each quarter, what activities within your program's top codes are being done, as well as answering these narrative questions. And we really do see it as just a good safety measure. The process we do is kind of just tell me what you did by quarter by top code, but I'm sure there's other institutions who've maybe created a more robust worksheet or are still even using work plans, but those are not actually required anymore. So in regards to the changes in the reserve funds, for those who may not know, the reserve funds in California used to be called Tech Prep and then CT Transitions. And those reserve funds are about 10% under Perkins 4, and they've been shifted up to 15% under Perkins 5. So that's 15% of the total state Perkins allocation, which 2020-21 was around 5 million statewide. In the past, these were distributed automatically to the colleges, but for Perkins 5, they've been held back, and the states mentioned that they're going to be moving towards a competitive RFP process issued perhaps annually. However, we're in our second year of Perkins 5, so we have not actually seen any of the RFPs or have had access to those funds. So we're still waiting on this one component. So I like to say it's really TBD and maybe and may focus on these things, but it does give you a sense of where these additional funds may become available and how. So slightly different model than in the past, for sure. And this, of course, as you all know, for those who've been in it, has impacted perhaps how you do a lot of your high school to college or non-credit to college articulation agreements, because that's what the tech prep and CT transitions funding used to be for. Of course, Perkins still can cover those costs, but it does shift sort of where you do it and how you plan. And that would have an impact on your CLNA and then the 2-year justifications for those expenses. So all remains to be seen what happens with this area. The last item out of the 8 that I want to touch on in terms of basic changes is that Perkins 5 is now fully integrated into NOVA. This is something that happened a little faster than we expected. Everyone knows everything's being moved to NOVA, so that makes a lot of sense. But there have been some interesting new elements and some changes. So, for example, NOVA requires for Perkins the selection of the student success goals and metrics tied to the vision for success and student success metrics. So this is new. It is not, formally speaking, actually a formal accountability metric for Perkins. We still are all focused on the core indicators, but it is a requirement in order to submit our applications. Every activity you fund has to have a student success goal and metric tied to it. So now that it's being tucked into it, I think we can envision perhaps one day being held accountable to them. So I suggest you choose them wisely because they're pretty challenging and interesting new element. The other thing I want to mention is that there's been some changes in the functionality. So in the past, we used to use the online system for Perkins to submit formal documentation and have sort of support mechanisms for major changes. So for example, if you were deleting a top code or adding a top code, those kinds of things, all of that stuff is still allowable and you just work directly with your monitor, but it's no longer formalized into the online system. So it's not tracked in the same way. So again, you have to really develop local processes to ensure you're documenting that communication and that approval appropriately for audit purposes. So that's the basics, right? Those are the fundamental components. And I know that was fast. I do hope that it provided a good refresher for those who kind of know the work, and for those who are new, should give you sort of a starting point to again dive into a bit deeper. So before we kind of go into our next section here, that's with the basics, and now we're going to kind of share more insight into what we've been up to. I did want to call out sort of with all of those fundamental changes, kind of how they tie into challenges and opportunities. And I think this is sort of helpful bullets to keep in mind as we share some insight into what we've been up to at the local level. So a couple key areas, of course, are the implementation of a meaningful CLNA. This is a lot of work. And we want it to be meaningful, right? And that means it's going to be even harder, right? And so what does that look like? As I mentioned earlier, a lot of this is a culture change. And so really focusing on and caring about that culture change poses a lot of interesting challenges and opportunities. There's a need for more facilitation of data discussions to drive meaningful assessments, and a focus on alignment with other funding sources, the student success metrics, vision for success, those kinds of things. And then regional alignment. As I shared earlier, in our region, we're doing a lot of intentional alignment. But I didn't get into this, but it is a requirement. So we've sort of chosen to do some extra efforts in terms of the regional CLNA report and things like that. But some component of regional alignment is required for your CLNA. So as you may recall, in our first round, sort of at the last minute, we were all required to get our regional consortia chair to sign off on our CLNAs. And this was a big shock and a big shift culturally on how we organize Perkins. And so we believe moving forward that regional alignment is going to be more and more emphasized. And so perhaps even this spring and the new CLNA requirements as they come out from the state, you may see even more requirement for regional review, sharing, and alignment. We don't know what it looks like, but that is a big element. So I'm going to take a deep breath. That was a lot. And I know, the next part of this is going to go into what everyone's doing locally. And I did just want to take one moment to share about our district-wide coordination. So I know throughout the basics, I've kind of given a couple insights into kind of what we've been doing as a district to provide support. I did want to mention just a few other tools and resources. So first, I probably should have said this in the beginning, the San Diego Community College District has 4 institutions. So we work across those 4, and we do centralize a lot of services, especially for Perkins. And so when I talk about centralized support for Perkins, I'm talking about my office in particular being the lead liaison to the state monitor, organizing applications, quarterly reporting, overarching CLNA guidance, those kinds of things. We do a lot of this coordination through a monthly career education deans meeting. So we bring together from our 4 institutions, the lead deans on Perkins and Strong Workforce, and meet monthly to connect on those things as well as everything else related to career education. So this gives us a structure to some of this centralized support. Each of our institutions, though, does also have their local planning committees, of course, and then their advisory committees at the program level. And then we as a district provide a variety of specific Perkins tools. So we have a resource page, and I'll plop this in the chat in a little bit, that we have a Perkins handbook. We support our institutions with application templates and worksheets so they can utilize before entering information into NOVA. We've created the required uses annual worksheet I mentioned earlier, as well as worksheets for our quarterly reporting. We've got reference materials. And then for the CLNA specifically, we support our 4 institutions with a kickoff meeting to sort of go over all of the requirements, the reporting guide, and the worksheets. We have the consultation model we agreed to district-wide, and then we do provide some data and research at a district-wide level, and then our institutions sort of double down on that and do a lot of extra work at the local level, institution-wide and program-specific data, and then of course the regional collaboration. So there's a lot there. Really the fun part of this presentation we're about to get to, because I'm going to invite Ben and Tina to share what they're up to at their local institutions. So Ben is coming from MiraCosta, which is one of our 10 institutions in our region, and Tina is coming from Mesa College, which is one of 10 in our institution in our region, but one of 4 in our particular district that I just shared some insight to. So I'm going to hand it over first to Tina to give insight into what they've been up to. And I think this will be the most meaningful part of our presentation is really Ben and Tina, because it's where the work gets done. I'm at the district level, so you can more or less ignore everything I just said. Tina.
Thank you, Amarta. And I appreciate that overview, because no matter how long you've been doing Perkins, it's always good to kind of review the basics and ensure that you're meeting all the requirements. As Amarta pointed out, there's our state requirements, but there's also federal requirements that we need to make sure that we're meeting and maintaining data information on our campuses. So I really appreciate always having that overview and kind of bringing it back to the basics. So thank you for doing that. As Amarta said, San Diego Mesa College is part of the district. So you've already seen a lot of the forms and processes that we use within the district. So I'm really going to focus more on how we incorporated that into our campus culture. So if I could have the next slide. When Perkins 5 first rolled out, as Amarta mentioned in the beginning, a lot of times faculty kind of viewed Perkins as their opportunity to buy the equipment that they needed to support the program. So when I think of Mesa College, we have a goal to be the leading college of equity and excellence. And Perkins was really meeting that excellence requirement. What's the best, latest, greatest equipment, software that we can use in our classrooms to prepare our students to enter industry and be successful when they get there? Perkins 5 really provided us with an opportunity to shift that culture and now really embed an equity focus into all of those conversations. And one of the biggest things that we had to do was bringing in that institutional researcher with a CTE expertise. So someone who could pull out information related to our equity gaps on campus in terms of ethnicity, socioeconomic status, all of our special populations identified within Perkins. And so we really wanted to pull that information together and then share that with our culture in our campus, both faculty, classified staff, student services, as well as instruction. Next slide. So what we did is we really looked at the flow of information and how we envision it should work on our campus. So we have each of our individual program assessments, but then we want to take all that information and how students are performing in programs, but what students are missing from those programs compared to our overall college population and even our community's population. And then we want to take that information and compare it to the institution as a whole. Are the programs matching the demographics of the institution and the student success of the institution or not? And we really want to constantly have a conversation focusing on that equity question. And in the end, are we moving the needle? Are we making a difference in the way that we're spending these funds? Next slide. So really that entire first year and a half was really all professional development. So we had to pull the data, we had to have conversations, we had to look at the new Perkins 5 requirements. What were they asking us to do? What were they looking at assessing? The form that Amrita already shared in terms of the 6 areas and doing a program assessment, we shared that with all of our faculty and we taught them how to really analyze their programs. We had a data expert come in and actually sit with them and do data presentations and look at the dashboards that had been set up for our campus and looking at how to pull information related to their program, but then how to look at the data in their program and ask questions about how to improve that data and how to reach out to students and really support students towards success. So a lot of training. We did create a local CTE planning team. We pulled in representatives from all the special populations. So we have programs on our campus for former foster youth. We have EOPS, Umoja, Avanza, DSPS. We pulled in representatives from all of those groups to be part of these conversations. And I put a little outline of our first big meeting and all the different topics that we went through to kind of take participants through a journey of the benefits of CTE and the changes that we're making to really improve students' lives. And then we went into all of the Perkins specific things. What do you really need to do to apply for Perkins funding under Perkins 5? And I will say this last one I stole from Ben when he was at his previous institution, because he shared with me that he was having one-on-one meetings with each of his faculty to really look at data and the changes they wanted to make in their programs. And we really incorporated that, and that really made a huge difference because now we could have rich conversations about ways to really engage the entire campus in supporting student success within each of our programs. Next slide. So now, what are we doing? The biggest thing we found out is we want to continue this focus on equity. We want to continue to improve our data on special populations and sharing that with faculty. But we really need to look at how we can improve our processes on campus. If we go to the next slide, there's just too many committees, right? We have a local CTE planning team. We have a strong workforce team. We have subcommittees of our strong workforce committee. We have subcommittees of our Perkins team. And then we have all our normal college representation of like program review and budget allocation committees. And it's just too much for CTE faculty. There's so few of them and they have to serve on so many different committees and they have to do so many different reportings. And a lot of these reportings are duplicative. So why are we making them do so much to get these funds that they need to support students? Next slide, please. So this is just an overview. I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can see what we created in terms of the composition of our CTE local planning team versus our strong workforce committee that already existed. And if you look at the two, there's a lot of overlap between the two. So this year, the conversation is really, do we need two separate committees? Why don't we just embed these two committees together and have one career education committee, right? And then we're not asking even all our student services representatives to serve on all these different committees. We're having one big career education conversation. We're all looking at the same data together at the same time, and everyone's involved in those conversations. So if we go to the next slide, it just shows even what some of those subcommittees are within each of them. And so this is where, same thing, we want to merge these subcommittees together so that it's the same people in the same conversations hearing the same thing. You'll notice under strong workforce, we have a marketing and outreach committee. We didn't have that in Perkins, but we had a lot of programs that were funding marketing and outreach to special populations with Perkins funds. So strong workforce didn't even know we were doing that. So it's one of those things where we really need to get people in the same room so everyone's on that same page. So next slide, please. So when you look at our duplicative processes that I mentioned, our campus requires every program to do a program review annually. Then under this new Perkins requirements, we had the Perkins program assessment. Then from that, you do a Perkins application. And if you want strong workforce funding, you had to do a strong workforce program application. So it's just too much, right? And we kept hearing that from faculty over and over again. And why can't we just put all this together? So really the conversation that we're having on our campus is we're going to do that Perkins program assessment. And we're really working with our college to say for CTE programs cannot serve as their program review. If there's a little bit extra information you want in terms of the campus for program review, let us know, but we really want that to serve as the overall program assessment, because then we can take that data to our career education committee to have the campus-wide conversations. And then in terms of that program assessment, now we can have conversations in the committee about who needs resources, what are those resources they need, and then does it make more sense for it to come from Perkins or strong workforce? Let's make that decision first and then only have them apply for exactly where the money's coming from and only speak to those points. So that's the direction we're currently moving on campus. So if we go to that next slide. So this is what we're looking at. Our career education committee will be meeting monthly. Program reviews always done in the fall. From that program review, once all those program reviews are complete, we can take that in the spring to the assessment of the overall program and college performance in CTE, and then really have conversations about where the money should best be spent. And then that Perkins annual allocation actually aligns with our college resource allocation. So those two would kind of happen simultaneously. But what's interesting about strong workforce, what we've rolled out over the last year, we have large projects that are strong workforce that money is allocated towards, but then we are reserving funds each year for programs that have immediate needs. So we actually have a smaller application where programs can request funding based on immediate needs. And we review those monthly about how we can meet those needs now, because there are those limitations with Perkins about it being annual. And sometimes we can shift, but the strong workforce just had more flexibility in that area. So that's where we're trying to hit consistent needs across our campus throughout the entire year. And faculty have really appreciated that. So that's a quick overview. I know we're short on time, so I'm going to turn it over to Ben. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tina. I love hearing all the work that Mace is doing. We've done this presentation a couple of times now, And every time I see Mesa progressing, and what's so interesting is because I think we've done this presentation so much together, I start to see how much we're blending our approaches. So this is helpful for me. This is professional development for me, and I hope it is for all of you tuning in. So at Miracosta College, which is not a part of the San Diego Community College District, but is definitely in the same region, and so therefore we work together, you're going to see some similarities in that work. I'm new to Miracosta. I've been here since January of 2021. Prior to that, I was at San Diego Miramar College, which is how I know these two fine colleagues working together on Perkins and Strong Workforce. When I came to Miracosta, though, I wanted to sit and listen to the faculty about our processes. And at Miracosta, we currently have completely separate Strong Workforce and Perkins processes. And so one of those ways that I started in this position, I wanted to take a full evaluation. I had heard a couple of faculty in my ears about how much work it was to go through Perkins and Strong Workforce. So I brought in a researcher from our institutional research office, and I had her read through our Perkins and Strong Workforce planning documents, and then also our planning processes. And she put together some questions and did a 45-minute evaluation interview focus group with our Perkins Planning Advisory Group. And then also a 45-minute similar focus group with our Strong Workforce Advisory Group. And she wrote up some evaluations based upon what she heard from those questions and what she saw in our planning processes. And what we discovered is that actually our Perkins planning processes were fairly strong at Miracosta, and faculty really appreciated the processes. The current application process for Perkins is just one single page. It starts with the data and then moves directly into objectives and activities, all in one single Excel document. And the faculty really appreciated that. There were separate tabs, or there's separate tabs on that Excel document that show all the various required uses, permissive uses, our CLNA strategies that we've identified as a campus. So that way they're able to utilize all of those various aspects into writing their application. And that's something the faculty really appreciated. What stood out, though, was that the CLNA was too much work onto the faculty. So the faculty had their program review processes, they had their biannual review processes, and then they had their CLNA program assessments, all in the same semester. And it was just luck. We were just lucky that the state had us on this 2-year cycle that matched the other cycles that we were on. So that was just way too much work. We were basically asking them to answer the same questions 3 different times. And so we're looking now at changing that. We also looked at our needle movement, and this particularly came out of our Strong Workforce plan. That was a 5-year plan. And we looked at the launch board, and I had researchers pull from the launch board and compare against the goals that we had established that we were going to try to work toward, and see where we had movement in improvement of student outcomes. It's probably not a surprise that it wasn't significant movement. And so we're having those types of conversations about what we're going to do about that. And then third, we took stock in the sense that with equity, it was always a bolt-on. It's been a bolt-on. It's, we have 5 goals outlined, and then, oops, let's add a 6th goal where we're going to tackle equity. And that we just determined was not okay. And then furthermore, I'm going to launch a complaint that in Perkins, we have our special populations, which is supposed to be our equity focus, yet nowhere in there do we call out racialized subpopulations as a focus. And yet our entire equity work, all of our disproportionately impacted populations are built around our racialized student groups. And then of course, other identities. But for the fact that in Perkins, we're not starting there, there's misalignment. And so we decided that we were going to tackle that misalignment by making sure that equity and that racialized groups are a part of what we're taking into account at Miracosta. And then, so on our next slide, we're going to, these are the problems that we discovered. Our Perkins process was beloved, but our strong workforce process is not, because we still make faculty go into Nova and enter their plans in Nova. And strong workforce is just, that's a lot of work for them. And then on top of that, then having the Excel document in Perkins that they love. So with Perkins, we had completely different timelines and application periods. And because of the way that strong workforce worked, we were always a year behind. I'm sure none of you have had that problem at all with strong workforce. And the faculty were just exhausted. And then when we would have conversations, it just came down to my program needs this, my program needs that, my program dollars, my program. And the conversations aren't about my students are having difficulties here, and therefore my program needs to improve this, right? So having the conversations around the dollars rather than around what the student needs was something that we need to change. And then, so on the next slide, we have our proposed solutions. We're going to see how these go. So we're going to develop some simple forms with a rubric, and we're going to redo our entire rubric. We determined that our rubrics just don't make sense at this point. It's a score of 0, 1, or 2, and we don't really define out the difference in the scores. So we're going to redo our rubrics using what I did at Miramar College. We're looking at changing our strong workforce application to match our Perkins application, where we start with the data of the LMI and just talk about some objectives, activities that tackle those issues that are identified in the data. And then we're hoping to align all of those processes with program review. So instead of having faculty do a separate CLNA program assessment, we're just going to pull from the program review document, pull from our biannual reports, and utilize that information and talk not just at program level, but talk at the institutional level about what our institutional processes are, see where we have institutional alignment of what faculty have said they need in their particular programs to serve their students' needs. How at an institution do we see that work aligned? And then from that, developing our strategies in our CLNA, limiting down the number of strategies that we try to tackle, because we saw very little needle movement, as I said, when we were taking stock, right? So if we have very little needle movement, it's probably because we're trying to move too many needles all at once. So instead, focusing in on 1, 2, maybe 3 needles that we're all collectively going to attempt to move together and try to solve those problems aligned across the entire institution. And we want to focus in on innovation and improvement. How many of you see applications for the exact same thing every single year from the exact same programs? You know which programs they're going to apply and you know what they're going to ask for. How is that innovative? How are we changing our institutions? We have an opportunity with strong workforce, with as much funding as we're receiving, to move away from asking for the same stuff and to start being innovative. And we have to challenge ourselves. And it's challenging conversations. Believe me, the faculty conversations that I have are challenging when I'm talking about innovation, because it feels like I'm attacking the heart of the funding sources that our faculty count on to keep their programs running. So talking about innovation, talking about how they're using the program review and resource allocation processes of the college, as well as these processes in Perkins Strong Workforce, and how they're aligning their requests and their work. That all is just a big ask for all the work that we're doing. And I know that we're coming up on time, so I shot through all of that. I'm hoping in our next presentation, I'll have more information about how all of that alignment and that work has progressed into the spring of next year.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Tina. So real briefly, we're not going to run through this whole thing. I want to open it up for questions, but here on the slide are obviously some lessons learned and just some highlights, right, that capture a lot of what Ben and Tina shared. A lot of important work underway and resources to sort of support those efforts, right, being tested and planned out. Let's open up for questions and discussion. We want to, hear if you've got specific questions of anything we raised or addressed, and also if you want to share something you're doing within your institution. So please feel free to unmute or raise your hand. We're happy to answer things and hear what you're all up to as well. You're soaking it in, right? I know Tina and Ben covered a lot and in a very short amount of time, and it's really exciting, interesting work. So we'll take a few quiet breaths while you think about any questions you have or things you want to share. Thank you. We got some accolades in the chat. We appreciate that. Well, is there anything, Ben or Tina, you might add in terms of lessons learned or recommendations or observations in our last few minutes together?
I want to highlight something Tina said that I wanted to say, but try to rush through. That's on this page, is that starting with the data. Start with the data. I can't emphasize that enough. Using the core indicators and the Strong Workforce Launch Board and your LMI all at the same time, and looking for the gaps, utilizing and leveraging your institutional research office, pulling together those data and having those conversations with the faculty, where you ask the faculty, I see a gap here, tell me about this gap. And it's amazing the level of detail your faculty can get into. Some of the gaps you might see are in women in maybe automotive or diesel programs, and how those conversations work. And your faculty will say, well, that's just industry. And you get to push back on that and saying, but is that how we want industry to be? Is there a legitimate purpose for that? And leading with those data questions allows for you to push in positive ways that you explore the data.
Thanks, Ben. And that's a big culture shift too, right? A lot of the program management sometimes is disconnected to local research offices, right? And so bringing them in early, helping them understand the purpose and intent of the work so that they can provide you with support about what kind of data and when and for what dates, those kinds of things. The earlier those conversations can start, the better. And it certainly is. It's a lot of additional elements that'll be well worth the investment in terms of time and timeline if you do it early. So thanks, Ben, for highlighting that.
And I would just say it takes time. So it's not something that you're going to be able to shift overnight or even in one academic year. It really takes time to get that data, to understand it, to have those conversations, and to really start to shift the culture. So be patient. Any baby steps you make are great. And eventually, we're all moving forward and constantly doing that improvement process.
Celebrate every little improvement. Celebrate that win. That's a big win to change culture, especially as Amrita mentioned, right? Perkins 4 was back, that was back in 2006. And it took until 2019 to get a reauthorization. So, or a reauthorization implemented. So yeah, that's a 12 years. That's 2 cycles of reculturing right there.
Yeah, we're really just in the beginning stages of this. And you can see that with the kind of supports and systems and NOVA changes, it's all just in the beginning. And so the sort of growing pain is very normal and yet a little painful, but exciting too, because we have an opportunity to really make change with the new requirements. So, well, thanks everyone. I know technically this ends at right now, this moment, but we're happy to hang on just a few more minutes. If you do have questions or you want to talk quietly to the side of the room, we can pretend we're in person. We would just go to the corner of the room, right, and chat a little bit. There are, of course, many other great sessions coming up. I think there's one 10 o'clock session at the plenary session, right, at 10 o'clock, just a minute or two. And then we have some stretch breaks and then an afternoon breakout session. So hopefully you're sticking around in the virtual space to participate in the rest of the conference today and tomorrow. And then next week, we've got 2 or 3 days, I think, next week of great presentations from colleagues all over the state. So thanks again for being here and for participating. And we'll hang out for just another minute or so if you do have questions.